I'm a certified nursing assistant. It's a CNA for short. I've been attending the needs of the elderly for over 5 years now, and I've seen some of the strangest behavior from the near dying. There is one instance that I can truly never explain. I felt like some of you might be able to shed some light on the matter, so I took the time to write down my experience. If you have any idea of what I might be dealing with, well, please let me know. I'm currently unable to find an answer, and I'm unsure if I should keep this creepy bird. Madeline Wright was 92 years old. I can honestly say that she was the sweetest old lady I had ever met. She rarely had visitors, but every Tuesday she would receive a package full of peanut butter cookies. The package had no return address, and Madeline would claim they came from her grandson. Most of our patients would gladly consume any baked goods that were sent, but Madeline saved these particular treats for her pet. We had a policy about small pets that as long as they could be contained within the room, they were allowed. Madeline had a macaw named Pete. Almost every day when I would make my rounds, Madeline would be sitting by the window, sliding small pieces of cookie through the cage. Pete would nibble them and squawk in appreciation. I would check the room for anything that needed immediate attention, speak with Madeline to make sure that she didn't need anything, and exit soon after. She would watch with her little smile as soon as I left, and as soon as I passed through the door, she would begin to whisper to Pete. The routine was so comforting, but I always wondered what the two of them talked about. Christmas came and most of our residents were congregating in the common room. They played games and exchanged gifts. We passed out Christmas cookies and non-alcoholic eggnog. It was the best party we could provide, complete with cheesy Christmas music. I stood among the elderly, admiring the freshly decorated tree, and I realized that Madeline had not attended our little get-together. I made it a point to check on her every day, even if it was not my duty for the day. So I decided to take a trip down the second hall and made my way to her room. Madeline sat in the dimly lit room by Pete's cage. She was speaking to the bird, but quickly fell quiet when I entered. She gave me that same sweet smile and asked how I was doing. I assured her I was fine, and I asked why she was not participating in the festivities. I learned that her late husband had passed during Christmas season, and the celebration only reminded her of that fact. I felt so horrible at the thought. I decided to spend the rest of my night keeping her company. And that was the first night I was introduced to Pete, formally. Now, this little lady had developed a true friendship with her bird. They knew everything about each other, and Pete had a personality that shined when you engaged him. I could ask him anything about Madeline and learn exactly what I needed to know. I listened to full stories about Madeline's history, including an embarrassing memory that involved Madeline losing her trousers on a trip to the river. Madeline blushed as Pete retold the story, and I tried to hold back my laughter. It was probably the most enjoyable night of my career, and I wish I could have had more of those. Sadly, Madeline passed away shortly after New Year's. I know I should not have watched her being wheeled out by the paramedics, but since she had no family, I felt she needed someone. I'd be lying if I said I did not cry. It was the hardest part of my job. I hated seeing our patients die, and each time it became a little harder. When the room was empty, it was my job to clean it and remove any personal items that remained. My eyes immediately fell on Pete's cage. He stood perched on a swing and stared at me. His eyes seemed cloudy and full of remorse, and I could tell he felt loss even more than I did. Pete took residence in our faculty lounge. My fellow nurses took turns speaking with him and feeding him. All of them enjoyed the constant reminder of Madeline's life. but some of them made comments about strange stories the bird would tell. I chalked it up to idle rumors and gossip until I heard one of them myself. I was grabbing a cup of coffee while on a late shift, and Pete turned to me to tell me that I should check room 204. I found it odd that even he knew how to say those words, and I dismissed it as something he might have picked up from Madeline. I began my rounds and an announcement played through our intercom system asking for an emergency attention to none other than room 204. Now, the coincidence obviously piqued my curiosity, so I made my way to that room. Mr. Perkins had always been of the jovial nature, and most of our staff enjoyed his company. He was a jokester, and I was sure it was some new prank he had come up with. When I entered the doorway, I realized that this was far more than that. Mr. Perkins was seizing, and his body shaking violently. Several of the nursing staff attempted to stabilize, but within minutes his body fell still. Mr. Perkins was pronounced dead 5 minutes later. My emotions ran wild. I needed to compose myself. I found my way back to the break room and took a seat with my cup of coffee. My hands trembled as I took a sip and tried to push back the tears. I sat thinking of how terrible it must be to grow old and be forgotten in a place like this. All this just swam in my head as I heard Pete squawk from the corner of the room, and I remembered what he had said to me. I stood slowly, leaving my coffee on the table. I approached his cage and asked if he knew that Mr. Perkins was going to die. And I received a simple yes as a reply. I stared at the bright blues and yellows of his feathers and stared into his dark, beady eyes. His tongue clicked at his beak as if hungry, so I dug through our bag of birdseed to feed him. The pebbles plopped to the bottom of the cage, but Pete seemed uninterested in them. He simply stared at me, and I could only wonder what he wanted. I thought to question further, but I was afraid of the answer I might receive. I dug through Madeline's uncollected belongings to find a few remaining peanut butter cookies. I returned to the cage, crumbled them into tiny pieces, and passed them through the bars. Pete gobbled up the crumbs and gave me an excited "Thank you." The following day, a letter was presented to me by my employer. There was no return address or any identifying information. She simply told me that the letter had been left at the front desk and had been asked to be delivered to me personally. I found my way back to the break room and carefully opened the letter. And inside, I found the scribblings of the late Madeline Wright. Apparently, she had written the letter after our Christmas together. She had been so moved by my kindness that she wanted to gift me her favorite possession, her bird Pete. I read over the letter multiple times and looked back at the tiny cage. The bird fluttered its wings and I stood to greet him. I pulled out another cookie and fed it to him. That night, I brought Pete home. He was legally mine and I wanted to personally take care of him. And so I cleared off a space on an end table within my sitting room. The cage fit nicely and it would be the first thing I saw when I entered in the evening. I knew it would be the perfect place for Pete, and I found myself sitting by him and carrying on a conversation. It was interesting having a bird ask me questions about my life and commenting on the events. I found myself laughing at the quirky comments that Pete would come up with. When the hour became late, I bid the bird good night and headed for my bedroom. A squawk caused me to pause and turn back to the cage. Pete stared straight at me and said, "Room 103. When I arrived at work the next day, I immediately visited room 103. Dolores Wilson sat on her bed talking with her daughter. The daughter turned to me and asked if her mother had been receiving her daily medication. I stammered that I explained that I was not her regular nurse, but promised I would have her attendant come by to speak to her. The two of them were very confused, but I had seen that Mrs. Wilson was fine. I left the room and stepped back to the nurse's station and relayed the message that Mrs. Wilson's daughter had questions for her attending nurse. I started my rounds and let the eerie feeling of what Pete had said the night before fade away. My shift was almost over when the announcement came for emergency assistance, and I did not need to know the number before I started running to 103. When I arrived, the attending nurse stopped me before I entered. She had tears in her eyes. I knew the result, but, well, I asked anyway. Mrs. Wilson had experienced a massive heart attack, and they were unable to resuscitate. I instinctively wrapped my arms around the woman, rubbing her back and trying to console her. The entire time, my mind went back to Pete and the last thing he said to me. When I arrived home, I went straight to my kitchen. Pete watched as I passed, but made no comment. I grabbed the ingredients from the cupboard and started baking. I was tired and ready for bed, but I wanted to get these cookies done before I found rest. And an hour and a half later, I pulled out a tray of freshly baked peanut butter cookies from my oven. I let them cool and broke them into tiny pieces. I returned to my sitting room and fed Pete. He took 2 cookies down quickly, and I could swear he smiled at me. That is, if birds can smile. I made my way to bed, still thinking of the events of that day. And so the main reason why I'm writing this is because I think the bird living in my house can tell when someone will die. That fact is enough to scare anyway, and I'm not sure how to handle it. I woke this morning and prepared for work. I made my cup of coffee, and I made my way to Pete's cage. I had made a routine of giving him a cookie before leaving for work. He quickly ate the crumbs I offered, and when I went to exit my front door, he gave a loud squawk again. It caused me to turn back and look at him, as usual. He stared at me for a moment, my hand still resting on the doorknob. His words have caused me to return to my room and write this all down. I don't know how long I need to wait, but Pete's exact words were, "Don't leave the house." In the mines. I worked as a news reporter for an online magazine for many years. During my time with this company, I've heard some incredible tales and legends from all over the country, but there was one in particular which was quite special. And so, I was in a bar at this small village. I won't tell you the name, but all you need to know that it was located in Scotland. I sat at the bar and listened to the villagers around me talk, waiting for someone to pick up the subject of the dead body that was found before. The reason I was there in the first place. Now, sadly, no one spoke about it, so I just sat there and waited for something to happen. That was when I noticed the few elders talking about the times they worked in the mines. Now, I didn't make much of the conversation until someone brought up the question why the mine was actually closed. "Spirit of the mountain," one of the others said. He came to claim back what was his, as the others refused to believe him. He told a story. He said that had happened to him. Now, I loved spooky stories back then, so I wrote it down. Here's what he said. "Just like every other morning, we went down to the mine to dig further down that new shaft. As we got down there, the air around us seemed to suck up all our lights. The shaft had a weird smell to it, and at first, we didn't want to go down there. But we needed the money, so we had no choice left, other than to go down to that damn place. As we reached the end of it and started digging, we heard some kind of laughter from before us. It was weird, as there was a massive rock. Probably some lesser demon playing his dirty tricks.
Now, don't get me wrong on this. We all had our crosses with us. We definitely would not have gone down there without them. And so, as we continued digging farther, some of our comrades started feeling sick. We continued digging, and after a while we were certain that between the sounds of our pickaxe there was something different. It was like a constant hammering against the wooden plate. Some workers just threw it in there and went back up, but I, as well as some others, stayed down there. We really needed the money, though. After a few more hours, we dug up a chamber of some kind. It was huge and completely dark. We reported to our bosses before we went in to check what lay down there. The entire room was filled with gold coins. Now, obviously, we took as many as we could find, and we got out of there. The following days, a good friend of mine was found strangled in his home along with his entire family. He was down there with me, and he took away the most gold. We assumed he was slain by some greedy thief, but we found no marks that hinted a fight. It happened 2 more times before we started assuming that had to do with the gold that we stole from the place. The ones that survived brought back the gold, but it didn't stop. Most of the mine workers got very ill. We figured it was some kind of curse coming from that chamber. We had to go in for one last time to close it up, and would be awarded a huge amount of money if we succeeded. As we arrived at the chamber, we could hear laughing from inside. One of my fellows screamed in the chamber that whoever was inside was in danger, and that we would be closing it up. Suddenly, he started gasping for air and the laughter grew way louder. We could only watch as the invisible force killed him. As fast as we could, we closed it up with some wood and rushed out of it. But I could swear that as we turned to leave the shaft, we saw a figure standing at the end laughing. Now, no one has ever dared to go in there since then. Now, obviously, I was very interested. A huge vault filled with gold, just untouched because some myths of hillbillies. I would definitely go check it out tomorrow. Most likely it was just some hallucinogenic gas. The following day I went to the closed mine, carrying a flashlight, a gas mask, and a pickaxe. I broke open the entrance and went in. It was dark and my flashlight hardly lightened up that dang place at all. At last, in one point, that old fucker told the truth. After some searching, I found the shaft that they must have talked about. It had nothing to balance out its weight and seemed pretty new in comparison. There was a terrible scent coming out from it. I knew I would be better off putting the mask on, and as I did so, I could swear I heard laughter down the tunnel. I went in and found the wooden plank that over the ages had decayed and scattered upon contact. There, the laughter was again, but this time it seemed closer than before. Quite honestly, it scared the shit out of me, but I simply shrugged it off and went in. Now, I'm not trying to play the tough guy here, I was terrified, but just the mere thought of ancient gold coins was too amazing for me. I was amazed as the chamber was actually filled with gold. Maybe an old treasure chamber from an old civilization. So I filled my backpack and went out. As I left the chamber, I could have sworn I saw 2 red glowing eyes at the far end of the room. I rushed out as fast as I could. As I reached the exit, it was already late evening. Strange, I thought to myself. I arrived here about 10 in the morning and surely was only down there a short period of time. Anyway, I went to my car and drove off to get my stuff and leave. I was a rich man now and had no more business to do here. As I arrived at the inn I was staying at, everybody looked at me with a strange expression of pity. I grabbed my stuff and got ready to go back to London. Now this was about a month ago. I'm a millionaire by now, and have found my love for life and never have to worry about finances. Sometimes at night I hear laughter. It gets louder each time, and afterwards my throat hurts sometimes. But it may just be a strange reoccurring dream. Although it's happening more frequently in the last 2 weeks. But maybe I'm still just scared. However, I don't know how to explain the 2 glowing red eyes I keep seeing from my window. Meeting the Collector. The Collector had arrived. How did I know? I could smell him. Sulfur. Not to mention I could hear the hounds scratching ever so softly at the door. Now, regret was the most prominent emotion, with fear a close second. Being a good-looking, early 20s man, I thought I'd make the most of my 10 years he had given me. The meager 10 years I had to enjoy the fame, success, and money he had given me, in exchange for the one possession I had since come to realize is more important than any materialistic item anyone could ever have. And now I have lived out my given years, and it was time to pay him what was owed. Was it worth it? Certainly not. I mean, sure, it was great driving the latest cars, dating the most beautiful woman, and being on the front covers of numerous magazines, not to mention dining in multiple foreign countries many times a week. But now it had come to a very startling and abrupt end. Honestly, I didn't even notice 10 years had flown by. Well, whether or not I had noticed it, my time was up. He was walking up the stairs now, the stairs that had led to my bedroom, my sanctuary, my safe room. But I didn't feel very safe now. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard, it felt as though it was looking it could break free from my chest and escape, thus saving itself. But no, we were in this together. And the moon shone in brightly through the huge sheets of glass that served as windows to my domain, casting long shadows from the trees outside. Shadows that seemed to know my fate, and were dancing around my room now in anticipation of the event about to unfold once he had reached my room. His ascent up the stairs seemed to be taking forever, and the damn hounds of hell stood vigil at my door, scratching, assuring me that they were ready to tear me apart in the event I foolishly tried to run for it. The shadows continued to dance, and a raven landed by my window and stared in. Was it letting me know that it was guarding the window, or was it merely here to watch the Collector collect my soul? I lay in bed, clutching my sheets and wondering what exactly was going to befall me once he knocked on my door. It was locked, but would a simple man-made lock withstand a being hailing from hell? I rolled over and opened my bedside drawer. The moonlight proceeded to shine on my .50 caliber Desert Eagle, illuminating it as though to assure me that it was indeed the answer to my current predicament. But should I end myself and put the cold metal barrel to my head, or do my best to keep my nerve and shoot my aggressor once he entered? Rather the later. It was a long shot that it would work, but honestly, there's not much a dead man can do but hope. I glanced around my room for what might be the last time. The superfluously large television hung on the wall opposite my equally large bed. Beautifully expensive and exotic paintings displayed on every inch of wall space. Yet, another tribute to my ill-acquired wealth. The Persian rug at the end of my bed, covering the floor with its splendor. While observing the room, it became evident how still the night had become. No birds chirping, no dogs barking, not even the slightest hint of wind graced land at the present. The stench of sulfur grew stronger, almost to the point of suffocation. He had arrived at my door. The hounds had stopped scratching. In one last moment of hesitation, I decided to pray. Maybe this God people believed in would be merciful enough to spare me. But clearly, the last-ditch attempt at salvation was futile, as I heard a soft but eerily menacing chuckle from the other side of my door. He did not speak nor knock. He seemed to be relishing in my fear and anticipation of what was to come, by standing outside and laughing at me. And I wonder what he looked like. Would he look human? What would he use to accumulate my soul? Would it hurt? What would happen after he did it? Was there any way to perhaps bargain for a few extra years of life, even if reduced to poverty? The chuckling continued as I was trapped in my thoughts, desert eagle in hand, still glistening in the moonlight. Why had I done it? Regret once again seeped in as the pure reality of my imminent annihilation hit me fully, as though I had stepped into a busy highway. Fresh out of college and not a cent to my name. Selling my soul for more money than I could ever spend seemed like a dream come true. I had since come to realize that the dream had now become a nightmare. I'd sold my soul for riches and fame, and now neither the money nor the power I had enjoyed would help me now. My soul was no longer mine, and now the time had come for it to be taken. The laughing had stopped. I assumed time for jokes and mind games had passed and it was time for business. And I stood there in the dark now, Desert Eagle pointed at the door, waiting for him to try and break in. Perhaps I should start shooting before he even tried to enter. I moved closer to the door, intent to end him if possible before he had the slightest chance to get me. I squared up to the door, and I pulled the trigger. But nothing. I pulled it again and again. Not so much as a sound came forth from the machine made to take life. I set the gun down and stood there. There wasn't much else to do now. He did not kick nor ram the door. The doorknob simply began to turn. The sulfuric smell was now suffocating, and I could not breathe. The doorknob turned slowly, and once again, the brilliance of the moon showed me just how slowly it was turning. The door creaked open, and my heart seemed to stop. There was nothing at the door. A sense of instant relief washed over me. Perhaps he had simply been toying with my mind and would leave me to live out the rest of my days. But my thoughts were violently interrupted when I felt an icy finger run down the side of my face. I could feel his presence behind me. I could taste the sulfur now that he had me in his grasp. My knees trembled, and a cold sweat broke out across my brow. He continued to stroke and caress my cheek, as though we had once been lovers, and I broke down in tears and my whole body trembled. How I wanted to turn to get a look at the creature that had opened my door, only to appear behind me. But I could not find the strength nor the courage to face my doom. I grew faint and felt my knees give in, but I did not fall. He was holding me up, supporting me. His face, or whatever he possessed, neared my ear from behind. "It's time to go," he said so softly, almost seductively. And we went into the darkness.
Devil's Wood. I usually write creepypastas, some of which you're bound to have heard of. But today I got thinking about some experiences when I was younger. They can probably be easily explained now that I look back, but at the time, they were terrifying. There's nothing like the terror a child feels when they're totally convinced that something horrible is about to happen. And I decided to share some of these with you, and perhaps Here's some of yours. Anyway, the picture's very much related. It's a screen cap from Google Maps of the small wooded area I used to spend a lot of time in when I was younger. I lived in the area from the ages of 3 up until 10, and during those years I went into those woods more times than I could count. And God knows why, they used to terrify me. The wood was appropriately named Devil's Wood, and I'm not sure what the official name was, but the local teenagers called it that to scare us younger ones. And it worked, because a lot of strange things happen in that place. So, as with all the places like that, there were rumors and legends and whatnot that went on around there. One of the favorites was of an old tale of the gypsies who were meant to live in the clearing at the back, which is the narrow end you could see in the picture. Apparently, a few gypsies set up camp there, and as all witches and gypsies do in stories, they like to kill children. One of the utmost dares you could get when we played dares was to go into the back of the woods by yourself, touch the last tree you could, and then return. I had to do this twice, and both times, strange things happened. The trail to the back of the woods was a strange one. It zigzagged from side to side, taking really difficult routes, and several times the ground rose up in huge humps that were a murder to navigate through if you were on a bike. It would naturally get darker and darker as you progressed. And though sometimes the trail would take you very close to the edge, it always stayed dark. The first time I went to the back of the woods, I was, as a kid would be, who hadn't just been dared. I was going to do it, and I was going to take my time doing so too, to show all the older ones how scared I wasn't. Now, this sounds cliché, but I always say clichés only become clichés because they're true. The deeper you got into the woods, the stronger the feeling of dread you felt. It was deeply unnerving, but a child's pride is a lot stronger than fear, so I pressed on. I reached the last turn before the clearing and paused. I could have sworn I could hear something in the clearing at the back, and suddenly the previously ridiculous stories of evil gypsies came flooding back to me. I crept to the corner and peered around, and I think that was the first time in my young life that I ever truly shat bricks. There was an old caravan there. A small one, because they would have had to have towed it over the farmer's field, but a caravan nonetheless. Well, that first time, I didn't take too long to look at it. I was terrified that they were in there waiting. It didn't occur to me that the caravan was in a serious state of decay. I turned and ran, faster than ever. And fuck the trail. I just ran a straight line through those trees, the whole way swearing footsteps thudded behind me. I tried to tell everyone when I got out, but I know they thought I was just taking a piss. I guess it just looked like I'd gotten scared, ran out, and tried to make up a story to disguise my fear. However, I kept on and on about it, and eventually my friend Connor had enough of my rambling and told me if I was so sure, we'd go in there again and I could show him. Just a note you need to know about Connor. He's fucking insane. I'm not joking. He had no fear whatsoever, and basically, any trouble in the neighborhood, you could bet your bottom dollar it was him. So Connor and I set off after lunch. We were around 8, I think. He was, as usual, bold as brass, strutting into the woods like he owned them. I was a lot more timid, still terrified that gypsies lurked behind the trees waiting for us. I think Connor thought I was making it up, but sure enough, when we reached the clearing, there it was in all its battered glory. See? I remember shouting triumphantly, before I realized I could just be drawing attention to us. Before I had the chance to persuade Connor to run like fuck, he had walked right over to it and pressed his face against it. "You idiot," he told me. "It's not lived in." Before I could stop him, he'd pullen open the old door, which nearly fell right off, and went inside. As you can imagine, the inside of the small caravan wasn't really that interesting. Old leaves on the floor, mud scuffs. If anything of value had been left in there, it had been stolen. It took Connor about 5 minutes to get bored of it and hop out, and let me tell you, I was glad. To try and disguise a little of my fear, I took a walk around the back of it. The very back of the clearing was full of thorns and closely knit bushes, so it was basically a dead end. However, there was a distinct hole in the thorny bushes, and I peered closer to find that loads of old junk had been thrown in there. There were old sleeping bags, empty packets of food, water and alcohol, some old magazines destroyed by rain, just useless stuff like that. However, one thing leaped out at me as if being kind of strange. It was an army jacket. Not the type you can buy in shops, but a genuine army jacket with regiment badges. The only thing missing was the Velcro surname slip, which had been ripped off. Of course, there being an army base close by, Connor wasn't that disturbed. However, I had seen the soldiers often, and they were certainly a proud bunch. I couldn't imagine any of them getting rid of their uniform, or deserting, or anything like that. Connor was obviously bored now. He was taking the piss out of me for my epic escape from the forest. I was getting pissed off, to say the least. And just as I was about to tell him to shut up, something caught my eye in the undergrowth close to the clearing. I only saw it for a split second, but I could have sworn it was a man watching us. He was crouched in the undergrowth and seemed to be tattered and dirty in appearance, stockily built, but otherwise not really that remarkable. My breath caught as it sometimes does when you see something that shocks you, and I wheeled around to see if Connor had seen it. To my relief, he hadn't, and to my secret delight, he finally looked unnerved. "Did you see that?" he asked me. I nodded. We decided to climb down the ditch to the right of us and go through the farmer's field rather than go through the forest, as it was a lot safer in our eyes to risk getting chased by an irate farmer. As we walked on the thin strip of land between crop and ditch, we kept silent, eyes on the ground, wondering what we had just seen. We began to notice the empty packets at the same time. Old crisp packets, chocolate bar wrappers, the kind of stuff army guys are given when they go on training missions. High sugar, high energy things to keep them going in case of an emergency or stranding. At one point, we spotted an old thick green sock just lying there, and we were seriously starting to wonder what was going on. I had made a vow to myself to leave that damn place alone now. Now for the next few days, I kept to my promise. There was a weird tree standing away from the woods that had been disfigured one night after being struck by lightning. If you climbed the trunk, you could sit in the large hole the two separated trunk halves had made quite comfortably. There was room for several of us, but I sat there alone while everyone went exploring in that forest. Shortly after seeing the strange man in the back of the forest, weird things started happening in other parts of the neighborhood, which was originally blamed on foxes. You know, bins tipped over and hunted through, claw marks in doors, and eventually small animals like rabbits mauled or killed, found half-eaten. However, things quickly took a sinister turn when none other than Connor had the sheer shit frightened out of him. I wasn't actually there when it happened, but it was the talk of everyone the next day. Apparently, the idiot had decided to accept the dare to go in there after dark and had been attacked. It was legit because the police were called. I had to return home when I went out to see him as the police were arriving outside the house.
And when I finally saw him, he had some impressive-looking scratch marks down his arms. He was, of course, shaken, and it was strange to not see him showing off his war wounds. The story eventually trickled out. Connor had been attacked, presumably by the same man who we'd seen. A search was launched and the woods were placed out of bounds, and eventually the police found him. This man was obviously not right in the head. He had fled from the army, complaining that they were conspiring against him. He seemed to think he was some sort of secret weapon, and he had to flee and find his way in the wilderness so he couldn't be used as the main weapon in any other wars. Now, I think I had a hard time imagining this man ripping rabbits to bits with his bare teeth and scavenging through bins like some wild or stray animal. But of course, it had been him all along. And all because he was convinced that the army were out to use him as their ultimate killing machine. He seemed to believe he possessed unnatural powers. When the police found him, his fingernails were all ripped to shit. I'm not sure if it's true, but apparently, fragments of fingernails were found in the gouged doors, and the same jagged gashes were found on Connor's arms. Naturally, in such a small rural area, the newspapers and local news had a field day and stalked the news story so much that they eventually obtained enough information to attract the attention of the national news. They uncovered several strange things about the man. He had some really freaky beliefs, aside from the whole "I'm a secret weapon" one. Devil's Wood was incredibly close to the army base. If he really wanted to run from them, why choose a place so close? Well, it turned out that he had also heard of the gypsies and believed that their magic could help him. I always thought it was kind of strange that a fully grown man would believe what was essentially a kid's story. However, I had to take into account the fact that the caravan remained there, and it certainly wasn't his. The police, of course, returned to the woods, trying to find out if the man's ramblings had any truth to them, and discover who owned the caravan. However, they found the clearing empty of any caravan or junk, and fresh tire marks leading along one side of the farmer's field, turning into muddy tire tracks on the road, and eventually vanishing. No leads were ever found, and they eventually had to give up on that part of the case. However, this strange ex-soldier still kept up his tales on how they helped hide him, how they helped him discover more of his powers, and how they performed all these strange rituals. The most interesting part of it all was that for one such power, discovering ritual, they needed a young child. Connor didn't realize exactly what an escape he had. His parents shielded him from most of the information. They moved away shortly after. Like I said at the beginning, this is just an old story from my childhood that I always thought was rather interesting. At least I've got it out there, though. The Silent Study. Everyone has heard of some form of horrific science experiment. Things usually involving torture of subjects who are forced to participate against their will. Subjects of these experiments were typically prisoners of war, who were as good as dead anyway. Well, what if I were to tell you that one of these experiments took place in the United States? As difficult as it is to believe, it's true. In the 1930s, there was an experiment called the Silent Study. Finding any account of this experiment was nearly impossible, but in an old university library, deep within the archives, was the first-hand account from the scientist running the study, a Dr. Maxwell Adrian. 5th of August, 1948. The 1930s is a time in the United States history where poverty ran rampant more so than any other time in our nation's history thus far. This time period would also be the settling point for the most controversial and last study of my career. Getting subjects was simple, really. Find 10 homeless people no one would miss. And in the 1930s, this was as easy as going to the supermarket and getting 10 apples. We would lure subjects toward a van with the promise of food and money just for answering a few questions. What really awaited them was a syringe full of Demerol and a ride to a laboratory. All of the subjects were obtained simultaneously and were each placed in separate rooms upon arrival. They were told one thing, and one thing only. Do not speak for the duration of your time here. You are not to speak. Not one word. If you do, you will be immediately terminated. Compliance will earn your freedom at the end of 10 days. Do you understand? If subjects spoke to answer, they received a mild shock, and the instructions were repeated until they learned to nod as their answer. 7 out of 10 subjects were shocked once before nodding. 2 were never shocked, and 1 was shocked twice. This subject displayed the highest levels of anxiety. After each of the subjects were efficiently briefed, they were all put into one dimly lit containment chamber, with a lone door and no windows. The subjects were given no instructions, and we observed them for the first 24 hours. No food or water was given. Nothing of note happened during the first 24 hours. A lot of sitting in the corner, pacing and sleeping. We planned to go another 24 hours without nourishing them to see if they would elicit a response for survival needs or stay quiet for fear of certain death. At about 38 hours, the first subject snapped. He started yelling at the top of his lungs to be released. At this point, I walked into the chamber. As soon as the door opened, the subject stopped screaming. All the subjects just looked at me in awe. I walked to the center of the room, and without hesitation, I shot the subject in the head. The sound of the gunshot startled the subjects, but none of them screamed. Then, I slowly walked out of the room without saying a word. When the 48-hour mark hit, some assistants and I walked into the chamber with 9 equal plates of food and placed them in the center of the room. A female subject asked, "May we eat?" To which I turned and faced her, and again, without hesitation and without saying a word, I shot her. I removed 1 dish of food and my assistants and I left. The subjects were hesitant to eat their food, but after an hour, they had all begun eating in silence. 72 hours in, my assistants and I walked into the chamber yet again. 8 subjects remaining, 2 dead with their bodies beginning to rot. This time, we brought only 4 plates of food. The subjects displayed confused facial expressions, but did not say a word. Almost immediately after we closed the door behind us, the subjects approaching the food, and without speaking, they each ate half a portion of the food. This astounded my colleagues and I. This idea that altruism would prevail when only non-verbal cues were present. One of my more creative assistants got an idea that we should introduce aggressive cues to their environment. On the 96th hour, the subjects were all displaying sounds of severe fatigue. I entered the chamber with 2 assistants, 1 on each side with a single dish of food. They placed the food down and I reached in my lab coat, at which point all the subjects flinched. I pulled out a large knife, nothing fancy, something you would find in any kitchen, and dropped it on the ground. This made a loud sound which startled the subjects. I then walked out without saying a word. The door closed and each of the subjects were fixated on the knife until finally one got up and grabbed it. He just stood there in silence looking at it. And just then, another subject got up and picked up a plate of food. Before the subject could even touch the food, the subject with the knife violently stabbed her in the stomach. She fell to the ground, and he got on top of her, violently stabbing her all over until she lay there motionless. Blood now started to cover the floor as the subject took both plates of food and sat in the corner, eating in silence. It is now the 5th day, and we are down to 6 subjects. One of my assistants told me that during the night, the subject with the knife quietly killed another subject. We entered the room armed today with a lone plate of food. We examined the 2 newly dead subjects. It was such a paradox to see them killed in the same way, and yet so differently. One subject had at least 30 stab wounds, and the other had one right in the heart. We left the food on the floor and walked out silent as usual. As soon as the door closed, what we saw next shocked us like nothing thus far in the experiment. 2 subjects were sprinting towards the food. They were sprinting at rates which should theoretically be impossible for them, given how malnourished and fatigued they were. The subjects with the knife saw this and sprinted just as quickly to the center of the room. A violent brawl ensued, and it was happening faster than we could record it. In the end, 2 subjects had died, one from being stabbed in the stomach several times, and one from a snapped neck. An important thing to note is that the subject who originally had the knife was the one who had his neck snapped. The events that took place on the 6th day were things I thought I would never see in my lifetime. They disgusted us to a point I thought we would never reach. With only 4 subjects remaining and one with a knife, desperation started to set in. 2 of the subjects had spent 6 hours straight eating the dead subjects, biting off all the flesh, ripping open their torsos with their bare hands, and pulling out and eating all of the intestines. This made them sick, but they did not stop. The final subject had been docile from day 1 and continued to do so on this day. By the time we brought the lone plate of food in, all of the dead bodies were mangled, with the remaining parts scattered throughout the chamber. Blood now covered the floor and could even be seen smeared on the walls. Despite the feelings of horror and disgust we felt, we still did not speak, and none of the remaining subjects had spoken in 6 days. We dropped the food and left, and as expected, the subject with the knife took it. Hour 178. It has been a week since we started the study. We started with 10 subjects and we're down to 3. During the initial hours of the 7th day, the 2 subjects who turned to cannibalism got into a violent fight where the victor killed and ate the loser. However, the subject was left crippled, and having already consumed his rival, he snapped off his frail and now useless legs and is gnawing on them now. The other 2 subjects are sitting in silence, watching this subject enjoy his last meal while he slowly bleeds out and dies. At this point, all of my colleagues have quit, and some even hung themselves in the facility. I knew the experiment could not go on any longer. On the dawn of the 8th day, I walked into the room. This room filled with blood, vomit, and feces. To look into this room, never mind to set foot in it, was the most disgusting fate I could imagine. And I was the one who created this hell where everyone suffered but no one screamed. I walked into the room and spoke to the subjects for the first time in a week. Congratulations on completing the experiment. You have earned your freedom. I walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind me. Out of curiosity, I stayed to watch their reactions, not even caring if they killed me at this point. They just stared at the door for hours, as if it were some kind of trap. The docile subject finally walked out like a zombie. The remaining subject took the knife and slit his own throat. I left that god-forsaken place and never went back. It's rumored that the surviving subject lived for another 15 years. It did not speak a single word during that time.
For better or for worse, this experiment was conducted. What's done is done, and this is my account of it. Signed, Dr. Adrian. That report was found in an abandoned warehouse in New York City and was on the archive for only an hour on the fateful day that I was looking. The entry also contained a photo of a piece of paper that was found with the report, but was in a different handwriting which read, "Max, good luck in going forward with the project. We can't wait to hear how it goes." Initialed HH. There is no record of anyone by the name of Dr. Maxwell Adrian ever existing, and no mention of the silent study whatsoever. But what convinces me is the note at the end of the file, because if you zoom in on the bottom right corner, you could see a smudge, and if you look really hard at it, you can make out an image of the presidential seal.